The letter arrived on a Tuesday, but Susan Dawson did not read it until Wednesday morning, because Tuesday was the day her daughter took her first real step since the accident, and that single trembling step across the floorboards of Marcus Whitfield's ranch house was so overwhelming that Susan sat down on the porch and wept until there was nothing left inside her chest. She wept because of joy. She wept because of guilt. She wept because the man standing in the doorway behind her, the man who had spent 4 months on his knees beside her daughter with his big, patient hands and his quiet voice and his absolute refusal to give up, had never once leaned across the distance between them and said what she could see plainly in his eyes every single time he looked at her. And now the letter had come. The letter from her dead husband's brother, Theodore Dawson, who had ridden all the way from Abilene to inform her in his careful legal handwriting that she had 30 days to vacate the property she had been renting on the edge of Marcus Whitfield's land, because Theodore had purchased the deed from the landlord without telling her, and Theodore had plans for that land, and Theodore had never approved of his brother marrying a woman with so little family behind her. And Theodore had most certainly never approved of that woman moving herself and her crippled daughter within walking distance of a bachelor rancher in Jasper County, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1879. Susan stood on the porch with the letter in her hand, and she felt the familiar cold weight of betrayal settle into her ribs like a stone dropped into still water, because this was not the first time someone had tried to take something from her. It was just the first time she had something real left to lose. She had come to Jasper County 11 months ago with $42, a wagon held together with borrowed prayers, and a 6-year-old daughter named Clara who had not walked without assistance since the fever took her muscle strength the previous winter. The doctors in Houston had spoken in careful voices about permanent damage, about braces, about the likelihood that Clara Dawson would spend the remainder of her childhood being carried. Susan had thanked them politely and then walked out of their office and decided, with the quiet ferocity that had always lived underneath her soft exterior, that she was going to find somewhere she could afford to rebuild, and she was going to rebuild, and her daughter was going to walk. What she had not anticipated was Marcus Whitfield. She had gone back to before that first terrible morning, back 11 months before the letter, back to the beginning of everything, because understanding where she stood now required understanding how she had arrived there. The morning she pulled her wagon onto the land adjacent to his ranch, she had not even known the property was adjacent to anyone's ranch. The landlord, a Mr. Harcourt who operated out of Beaumont, had described it as isolated. He had meant that as a selling point. What he had not mentioned was that the fence line along the eastern edge of the property was shared with the largest working cattle ranch in the county, or that the man who operated that ranch would be standing at that fence line at 6 in the morning, watching her wagon list dangerously to the left as she tried to navigate the ruts in the road. He had not called out immediately. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Most men, in her experience, rushed to involve themselves the moment they saw a woman struggling. They made it about themselves, about their own usefulness, their own heroism. Marcus Whitfield had watched her for a full 30 seconds, and she had seen him clearly through the thin morning light, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair going silver at the temples, somewhere in his mid-30s, wearing a working man's clothes that were worn but clean. He had watched her, and then he had watched her again, and then, when the left rear wheel sank into a rut so deep the whole wagon lurched and Clara cried out from inside, he had simply walked to the fence, stepped through it, and come to help without announcing his arrival as a heroic act. "The wheel needs something under it," he said. Not a question. "I am aware," Susan said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that she could not name, something that had nothing to do with wheels or wagons or the flat morning light of a Texas autumn. "I have a board in my barn," he said. "I would be grateful for the use of it," she said. That was how it began. Not with longing glances or stolen touches, with a board and a wagon wheel and a woman who would not pretend she needed less help than she did. He brought the board. He helped her free the wheel. He introduced himself in 2 sentences and then stepped back and allowed her to take the reins and drive the wagon the remaining quarter-mile to the small house she had rented. He did not follow her to make sure she arrived. He returned to his fence line and went back to his work. Susan spent the remainder of that first day making the house livable. Clara sat in the doorway and watched her mother with the serious eyes she had worn since the fever, eyes that belonged on someone much older. Clara had been a running, climbing, laughing child before the fever. Now she moved through the world carefully, the way you move through a space where things had been rearranged and you were not certain yet where the sharp edges were. "That man was nice," Clara said toward evening. "He was helpful," Susan said, which was not the same thing, and Clara, who was 6 and extraordinarily perceptive, understood the difference. "He didn't say anything about my legs," Clara said. Susan stopped hanging the curtain she had been working on and looked at her daughter. "No," she said, "he did not. It was such a small thing, such a breathtakingly small thing." But in 11 months of doctors and neighbors and well-meaning strangers, it was remarkable how many people found ways to reference Clara's condition within the first 5 minutes of meeting her. Marcus Whitfield had handed a board to a woman he did not know, helped free a wagon wheel, glanced at a child sitting in a doorway, and then gone back to his work without making the child's body into something that required commentary. Susan hung the curtain and tried to remember the last time anything had felt simple. He came by the next morning with a basket from his housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Graves, who had cooked for the Whitfield Ranch for 12 years and regarded new neighbors with the particular ferocity of someone who considered feeding people a form of territory. The basket contained cornbread, a jar of preserved peaches, and a small pot of beans that were still warm. "Mrs. Graves sends her compliments," Marcus said, handing the basket through the door without stepping inside. "She wanted you to know there's a general store in town that carries most of what you'll need, and the owner, a Mr. Ballard, runs a fair price. Please thank Mrs. Graves," Susan said. She held the basket and looked at him in the pale morning light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not grief or exhaustion or the particular loneliness of being solely responsible for a small person who needed more from the world than the world had offered her. "I will," he said. He looked past her into the house briefly, not intrusively. "Is your daughter settling in?" "She is," Susan said. "Her name is Clara." "That's a good name," he said. And then he touched the brim of his hat and went back to his ranch. It was 3 weeks before Susan understood that Marcus Whitfield was not simply a neighbor who had decent manners. He was something rarer than that, something she had no precise language for yet. He was a man who paid attention without making his attention feel like a demand. She understood this on the afternoon. She was attempting to hang a new length of rope between 2 posts for a clothesline, and the rope was 10 inches too short, and she was standing in the yard with the rope in her hands, feeling the specific fury of a small problem that had become the last straw on a very long day. She had not asked for help. She had not made any sound. But Marcus, who was mending a section of fence perhaps 100 yards away and could not reasonably have seen her expression, stopped what he was doing and walked over. "I have extra rope," he said. "How did you know I needed rope?" she said before she could stop herself. He looked at what she was holding and at the 2 posts and at the gap between them. "Lucky guess," he said. He brought the rope. He did not help her hang the clothesline. He offered the rope and then stood back, and when she reached up to tie the extension and could not quite get the knot secure with her angle, he said quietly, "Do you want me to?" And she said yes, and he stepped forward and knotted it cleanly and stepped back, and the whole transaction took less than 2 minutes. And afterward he went back to his fence and she hung her washing, and the afternoon felt somehow lighter than it had before. Clara began watching him from the window. Susan noticed but did not comment on it, because she understood. There was something deeply restful about watching a person who knew exactly what they were doing. Marcus moved through his ranch with the easy competence of a man who had been doing this work for a long time and had stopped needing to prove it. He was not dramatic about anything. He did not raise his voice that she ever heard. His horses came to him readily. His men, a crew of 5 working cowboys who rode out each morning and returned at dusk, addressed him with the casual respect of people who trusted their employer because he had given them reasons to. It was Clara who broke the careful distance between Susan and the Whitfield ranch. One October morning, when the air had finally started to cool into something more manageable after the long Texas summer, Susan looked up from her garden to find that Clara was not where she had been. She had been sitting on the lower step of the porch, which she could navigate by herself now, and she had been drawing in the dirt with a stick, and now she was gone. Susan found her at the fence line. Clara had managed to drag herself, through what must have been significant effort and determination, a full 30 yards from the porch, and she was sitting in the grass at the base of the fence with one of Marcus's dogs, a big, gentle hound named Biscuit that had apparently come to investigate the small person on the other side of the fence. Clara had her small hands in Biscuit's fur, and she was talking to him in the low, serious tone she used when she considered something important. Marcus was there too, crouched on the other side of the fence with his arms resting on the lower rail, listening to whatever Clara was saying with the same expression he brought to everything, quiet and genuinely attentive. Susan crossed the yard with her heart hammering, because the distance Clara had covered was more than she had managed since the fever, and the independence of it was frightening and beautiful in equal measure. She came to find Biscuit, Marcus said, when Susan reached them. I hope that's all right. She's never gone that far on her own, Susan said, and her voice did something embarrassing. Marcus looked at her steadily. She moved carefully, he said. I watched the whole way. He had been watching Clara make that 30-yard journey through the grass. He had been close enough to help if anything went wrong and far enough away that Clara thought she was doing it alone. Susan understood this without having to ask, and something behind her sternum shifted in a way she was not prepared for. Clara, she said, you should have told me. I wanted to see the dog, Clara said with the unassailable logic of a 6-year-old. His name is Biscuit. I know his name. Mr. Whitfield told me. Clara looked up at Marcus with the calm assessment she brought to people she considered worth her attention. He said Biscuit is 4 years old and likes it when you scratch behind his left ear more than his right. That's true, Marcus said. Why, Clara said. I don't know, Marcus said. You'd have to ask Biscuit. Clara considered this seriously. Then she scratched behind Biscuit's left ear with great deliberation. It was such a small thing. Susan stood at the fence and watched her daughter laugh for the first time in months. The clean, uncomplicated laughter of a child who had momentarily forgotten everything that had been taken from her. And she thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. Not because of Marcus. Because of herself and what she was starting to feel, and how dangerous it was to start feeling anything when you were a widow with $42 and a sick child, and a dark past that you had carried a very long way from Houston. The thing about Susan Dawson's dark past was that it was not dramatic in the way dark pasts were supposed to be. It was not a secret crime or a hidden shame. It was simply the accumulated weight of having married a man who was charming in public and indifferent in private, and of having spent 6 years trying to be what he needed, and of watching her husband, Robert Dawson, drink himself into a smaller and smaller version of a person she had once loved, and of the particular loneliness of grieving someone who was still alive and standing in your kitchen. Robert had died in the winter of 1878, 8 months before Clara's fever, which meant Susan had been managing grief and recovery and financial ruin simultaneously, in a city that knew her as Robert Dawson's widow and had not known her as anything else for 6 years. The fever had broken her remaining resources and confirmed what she had already suspected, which was that Houston had nothing left to offer her. She had packed what she could carry, sold what she could sell, and driven north and west with the vague, desperate faith that somewhere in the enormity of Texas, There was a place where she could start over without the weight of who she had been. She had not expected Jasper County to be that place. She had not expected a neighbor with patient hands and a hound named Biscuit. November arrived and the days shortened, and Marcus began stopping by more regularly, never intrusively, always with some practical excuse that Susan recognized as an excuse, even as she accepted the practical reality of it. He brought firewood because the stack at the side of the house was running low. He brought a pair of thick wool blankets from his extra supply because the nights were getting cold and the house had thin walls. He brought information about the county, about the winter weather patterns, about which roads flooded and which held in wet conditions. And he began talking to Clara. Not in the way adults talk to sick children, with that particular lowered, careful voice that communicated pity even when it was trying not to. He talked to Clara the way he talked to everyone, directly and without softening the edges unnecessarily. He told her about the cattle and the seasons and the work of the ranch. He answered her questions, which were many and particular, with the same care he would have given an adult. He brought her a small illustrated book about horses that he had gotten from somewhere in town, and he sat with her on the porch one afternoon and read some of it aloud, not because she could not read herself, but because he was there and she was there, and the afternoon was warm and reading seemed like the thing to do. Susan watched all of this from a careful distance and felt the danger growing and did nothing to stop it because she could not identify anything concrete to object to. He was kind. He was decent. He was helpful. He asked for nothing. The complete absence of any request or any expectation was its own kind of mystery, because in Susan's experience, kindness had always eventually revealed the shape of what it cost. It was December when she finally asked him directly. They were standing at the fence in the early evening, which had become a kind of informal meeting place, the spot where they exchanged information about the week and the weather and the small daily news of two properties that shared a border. Clara was inside, asleep early because she had worn herself out on another independent journey through the yard. "Why do you do this?" Susan said. He did not pretend not to understand the question. Do what specifically? The firewood, the blankets, the books, the time with Clara. She looked at him steadily because she had learned that looking away was how you miss things. You don't ask for anything, you never have, I can't make sense of it. He was quiet for a moment. The evening had gone purple and soft and the cattle were moving somewhere behind him in the dusk. "I had a sister," he said. "She died when I was 22. Fever, same as Clara had, though it was a different kind. She was 8 years old." He paused. "I'm not trying to replace her. I know Clara isn't my sister. But when I see a child who is fighting that hard to get back something the world took from her, I don't need a reason to help. I just help." Susan looked at him in the purple evening and thought, there it is. Not a manipulation, not a hidden motive, just a grief that had found a use for itself. "I'm sorry about your sister," she said. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. They stood at the fence in the growing dark, and the honesty between them was clean and simple as a board across a rut in the road. In January, Marcus proposed something that Susan's first instinct was to refuse. He had been watching Clara attempt to cross the yard unassisted for several weeks by then, watching her progress and her frustration with the careful attention of someone who had thought about it deeply. Clara could manage the porch steps. She could cover 30 or 40 yards on a good day, but her balance was still unreliable and she tired quickly, and the doctor's warnings about permanent damage lived in the back of Susan's mind like a hidden trap she could not disarm. "I've been reading," Marcus said at the fence one morning. He produced a folded pamphlet from his coat pocket. "There's a doctor in Galveston, a man named Hargreaves, who works with children who have had muscle damage from fever. He's developed some exercises. They're described here." He held out the pamphlet. "I don't know if it would help, but I thought you might want to see it." Susan took the pamphlet. She read it standing there in the winter morning. It described a series of graduated movements, carefully sequenced, designed to rebuild the specific pathways between brain and muscle that fever could disrupt. The language was technical in places, but the principles were clear. He says children need to practice the movements correctly and consistently, Susan said. For months. Yes, Marcus said. I was wondering if you would allow me to help with that. He said it carefully, as though he understood he was stepping into territory that required her explicit permission. I'm not a doctor, but I have time in the late afternoons and I'm patient, and I think Clara might respond to having someone besides her mother work with her. Children sometimes do. It was the most he had ever asked for, and it was not, Susan realized, actually an ask for himself at all. It was an ask on behalf of her daughter. She said yes. What happened in the months that followed was not dramatic in the way that miracles were dramatic. It was slow and incremental and sometimes deeply discouraging. Marcus came to the house every afternoon, usually between 3 and 5, and worked with Clara on the exercises from the pamphlet, which he had written out in clear handwriting on larger sheets of paper, so they were easier to follow. He was not a doctor, and he said so plainly, and he suggested 3 times that they consider making the journey to Galveston to see Dr. Hargreaves directly, and each time Susan had to explain, without detail, that Galveston was not financially possible. Marcus did not press the subject. He simply continued coming. He built Clara a small set of rails in the yard, 2 parallel wooden bars at roughly the right height for a child to hold and walk between them, the kind of support that allowed movement without requiring balance. He built them over a weekend without announcing he was going to do it, and when Susan came out Monday morning they were standing in the yard, smooth and solid, the wood sanded clean so there were no splinters. Clara saw them and her face did something complicated. She walked to them with Susan's hand, and she stood between them for a long moment looking down at her feet. "You just put your hands here," Marcus said. He was standing off to the side, not over her, not crowding her. "And you walk, that's all." "What if I fall?" Clara said. "Then you fall and I'll help you up and you try again." Clara looked at him with those serious eyes. "That sounds like it hurts." "Sometimes it does," he said. "But you already know about things that hurt, don't you?" It was not a question. It was a statement that acknowledged, without softening, that Clara had already survived something hard and that this was not as hard as that. Clara considered this with the gravity she brought to everything, and then she put her hands on the rails and she walked. Not far, maybe 4 feet. But she did it herself, with the rails for balance and Marcus watching from the side with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral, because he had understood somehow that Clara needed to do this without anyone making it an occasion. When she reached the end of the short rails and stopped, he simply said, "Good," in the same tone he used to say it to his horses, and Clara stood straighter. February was hard. The exercises were boring and repetitive in the way that necessary things often were, and Clara was 6 years old, which meant her patience had natural limits. There were days she refused, and days she cried, and days she sat at the top of the porch steps and said she did not care about walking anymore. Marcus took these days with the same equanimity he took the good days. He did not push. He did not negotiate or bribe. He would sit with her on the porch and talk about other things until she was ready, or until the day was over and they both acknowledged that tomorrow was another chance. Susan watched all of this from the window or from the kitchen doorway, learning things about patience she had not known she needed to learn. She also found herself, in February, doing something she had not done in years. She found herself looking forward to 3 o'clock. Not because of what 3 o'clock brought for Clara, though that was the stated reason. She looked forward to 3 o'clock because it brought Marcus Whitfield to her yard and to her porch, and to the conversation that inevitably found them standing together after Clara went inside, talking about nothing urgent and everything real. He told her about the ranch, which had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, 3 generations of Whitfields in Jasper County. He told her about the years when cattle prices fell and how the ranch had survived them. He told her, carefully and without dramatizing it, about the woman he had been engaged to 8 years ago, A woman named Catherine who had decided, 6 months before the wedding date, that she did not want to be a rancher's wife after all, and who had left for Dallas and married a banker, and about how Marcus had spent 2 years being angry and another 2 years being honest with himself about the fact that they had wanted different things, and Catherine had simply been braver about saying it. "Were you very heartbroken?" Susan asked him once. "For a while," he said. "Then I was just honest. She wanted a different life. There's nothing wrong with that." The absence of bitterness was one of the things Susan noticed about Marcus, in the way you notice the absence of a sound you had been braced for. He had reasons for bitterness, the way most people did, and he had simply chosen not to carry them. It was not a performance of goodness. It was something quieter than that, a decision he had made about what kind of man he wanted to be, and the decades of practice that had made the decision invisible. Susan had reasons for bitterness too. She was choosing, imperfectly, not to carry all of them. She was getting better at it. She suspected this had something to do with 3 o'clock. By March, Clara could walk the full length of the rails unassisted. By early April, Marcus had built a longer set, and Clara was walking those. By April's end, she was crossing short distances in the yard without the rails at all, with Marcus walking alongside her, not touching her, but close enough that she knew the option was there. Susan stood in the kitchen doorway on a warm April afternoon and watched her daughter walk 30 feet across the yard and turn around and walk back, and the joy of it was so enormous that she had to grip the door frame. Marcus caught her eye across the yard and said nothing. But his expression said something she did not have words for, something that landed in her chest and stayed there. She began to understand that she loved him. Not suddenly, not with dramatic revelation, but with the growing certainty of someone who has been looking at a truth for months and finally stops pretending they cannot see it. She also understood that it was complicated. She was a widow with a rented house and very little money and a child who still needed significant care. Marcus was a successful rancher with a settled life and a reputation in the county as a decent and upright man. She did not know what she represented to him, whether she was a neighbor he found appealing or something more fundamental than that, and she was frightened of reading it wrong. She had read things wrong before. She had spent 6 years married to a man she had misread almost completely. The secret she had been carrying, the darkest part of the dark past, was this. She had known, on her wedding day, that Robert Dawson was not the man she hoped he was. She had seen it in small moments, in the way he dismissed the server at the restaurant, in the way he spoke about his family with a contempt he only barely concealed. She had told herself these were small things. She had married him anyway, because she was 22, and in a city she barely knew, and he was the first person who had made her feel chosen. She had paid for that decision for 6 years. She was not going to make another decision out of loneliness or gratitude. So she held what she felt for Marcus Whitfield at arm's length and watched him carefully, looking for the thing he was hiding, the trap at the bottom of his kindness, the dark thing that would reveal itself eventually. She looked for it all through March and April and into May, and she did not find it. What she found instead was more of the same: consistency, patience, quiet humor, a man who was exactly who he appeared to be. This frightened her more than any hidden motive would have. It was in May that Mrs. Graves, who had decided that Susan was acceptable based on criteria Susan never fully understood, began inviting her over for tea on Sunday afternoons while Marcus was occupied with the ranch accounts. Mrs. Graves was not subtle. "He hasn't looked at a woman since Catherine," Mrs. Graves said, on the third Sunday, pouring tea with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly how long she had. 8 years. "I've watched women try, very determined women. He's always polite and always unavailable." She looked at Susan with small, sharp eyes. "He volunteers to help your daughter every single afternoon." "This is notable. He's a compassionate man," Susan said carefully. "He's a man in love," Mrs. Graves said. "I've known him since he was 12 years old, and I am telling you plainly what I am seeing." Susan put down her cup. Even if that's true, she said, I don't know what to do with it. You could start by allowing yourself to believe that someone decent can want you, Mrs. Graves said, just as a concept, just to practice. It was blunt and it was kind, and it went home with Susan and lived in her chest alongside everything else. May became June, and June was when Clara began walking without rails or support for distances that counted. She still tired. She still had bad days. But she was walking, genuinely walking, the kind of walking that looked like a small girl walking and not a child managing a difficulty. And the transformation was so gradual that Susan only fully saw it when she compared where they were now to where they had been in January. She sat on the porch with Marcus one June evening after Clara had gone inside, and she said, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, he said. You have given us months, she said. Your time, your materials, your patience. You built her those rails. You read that pamphlet and you researched it, and you have shown up every single afternoon for 5 months, and you have never her voice caught. You have never once asked for anything back. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. I didn't help Clara so that I could get something in return, Susan. It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix. She noticed it the way you noticed a door opening. I know that, she said. That's what I'm saying. I know it. And I don't know what to do with knowing it, because every kind thing I have ever been given has had a bottom to it, and you don't seem to have a bottom. He was quiet for a long moment. The evening was warm and still, and somewhere a whippoorwill had started its repetitive song. Susan, he said, can I tell you something honestly? Please, she said. I'm not a perfect man, he said. I have a temper I've worked to manage for 30 years. I have opinions that are sometimes wrong and that I hold too long before I revise them. I have spent 8 years being very comfortable being alone, and I am somewhat afraid of what happens if that changes. He paused. But I have never helped your daughter to earn something from you, and I have never spent time with you because I thought you owed me a return on my investment. I did those things because Clara deserves every chance this world can give her, and because I look forward to 3 o'clock every single afternoon in a way that I have not looked forward to anything in a very long time. The whippoorwill sang into the silence. I look forward to 3 o'clock too, Susan said. It was everything, and it was enough. They did not move quickly after that. There was no dramatic declaration under the stars, no swept-off-her-feet scene that left her breathless and uncertain. What there was instead was a gradual, deliberate warmth, something that grew like the summer corn, unhurriedly and without performance. He began walking with her in the evenings when the work was done, just along the fence lines and through the meadow grass, talking. He took her hand once, on a walk in late June when the ground was uneven, and did not let it go when the ground leveled out. She did not pull away. Clara noticed immediately, with the perceptiveness of a child who has spent months watching the world with more attention than she is given credit for. She did not say anything dramatic about it. She simply began including Marcus in the scope of her ordinary assumptions, the way children included the furniture and the weather, as something that was simply there and could be relied upon. And then July came, and with July came Theodore Dawson. He did not come in person initially. He sent the letter first, the one that arrived on a Tuesday and that Susan read on Wednesday morning with the ice of betrayal settling into her bones. Theodore had purchased the deed to her rented land. She had 30 days to vacate. Susan read the letter 3 times and then folded it and sat down at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic of what she had and what she needed. What she had was less than $12, a wagon, the furniture she had brought from Houston, and a set of parallel rails in the yard that belonged, technically, to Marcus Whitfield. What she needed was a place to live. She brought the letter to Marcus that afternoon before 3 o'clock, before the usual time, because she could not hold it alone any longer. He read it without speaking. His expression did not change dramatically, but she had learned to read him well enough to see the tightening along his jaw. Theodore Dawson, he said. My husband's brother, Susan said. He has never approved of me. He made that clear at the funeral and every letter since. Has he threatened you before? Not in legal terms, she said. He made it clear that Robert's death had not improved his opinion of my choices. He believed I should have been a better wife, that Robert's drinking was somehow my responsibility. She paused. He also believes I am too independent for a widow, which in his language means I have not done what he told me to do. Marcus set the letter on the fence post between them. He cannot force you to leave the county, he said. He can only force you off the property he's purchased, and only if he holds the deed legitimately. I have to assume he does, Susan said. Mr. Harcourt was clear in his last letter that he was considering selling. I didn't think it would be to Theodore. What does Theodore want? Marcus said. Me back in Houston, Susan said flatly, under his supervision. He has a vision of the appropriate life for his brother's widow, and it involves being visible and controllable and not living next to a bachelor rancher. She looked at Marcus steadily. He will come himself. He'll have sent the letter first because he believes a letter will accomplish it without the inconvenience of travel. And when it doesn't, he'll come, she said. Marcus picked up the letter. He looked at it for another moment. Then he said something that Susan had not anticipated. You could stay here, he said. She was quiet. On the ranch, he said. Not in the house. There's a foreman's cottage on the east side of the property. It's been empty for 3 years since my last foreman moved his family to San Antonio. It's small, but it's sound. You and Clara could use it while you figure out what comes next. Marcus, she said. I'm not asking for anything, he said, which they both recognized as not entirely true and which they both chose in that moment not to address directly. If I move on to your property, Susan said carefully, Theodore will use it against me. He'll use it to say that I am not a respectable woman. Theodore sounds like a man who has decided what to think of you and will find evidence to support that conclusion regardless of where you live, Marcus said. This was true. Susan looked at the letter and thought about her options, which were not plentiful. She could go back to Houston. She could find other rental property in the county, but with $12 and a 30-day window that was far from certain. She could accept Marcus's offer of the cottage and trust that she had read him correctly. She had been wrong once about trust. She did not think she was wrong now. She did not think she was wrong about this man. But the consequences of being wrong were too large to allow sentiment to make the decision. Let me think about it, she said. Of course, he said, and he said nothing more about it. She spent 2 days thinking about it, which meant 2 days of walking through every available option and finding them insufficient. On the 3rd day she went to Marcus with her answer, which was yes, with conditions. She would pay rent for the cottage, nominal rent, because that was all she could manage, but something. She would not accept charity. She understood the complexity of her position in the county, and she would conduct herself accordingly, meaning she would not give anyone legitimate cause for gossip, meaning she would be a tenant and not a guest. She said all of this clearly and waited. He agreed to every condition without negotiation. They moved into the foreman's cottage on the 15th of July, a week before the 30-day deadline in Theodore's letter. The cottage was small, as he had said, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch, with solid walls and a stone fireplace that would matter when winter came. Clara walked from the wagon to the cottage door herself, slowly and with concentration, and when she reached the porch she turned around and looked at Marcus, who was carrying a box from the wagon, and said, "I walked all the way." "You did," he said. "All by myself," she said. "Completely," he said. Clara went inside to examine her new room with the serious focus of someone inventorying a territory, and Susan stood on the porch and watched her go and felt, carefully and for the first time in years, something she identified as hope. Not desperate hope, not the kind you clung to out of fear of drowning. The quiet, settled kind. The kind that felt like it might actually stay. Theodore arrived on a Wednesday in early August, which was a hot and uncharitable month in Jasper County. He arrived in a hired carriage from the nearest stage line depot, which told Susan he had traveled far and wanted to make an impression. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s, dark-suited even in the Texas heat, with his brother's coloring and none of his brother's charm. He had Robert's habit of looking at the room when he spoke to you instead of at your face, as if he was calculating the value of the surroundings. He came to the cottage first and found it empty. Then he came to the main ranch house, where Susan had gone that morning to help Mrs. Graves with some mending, because Mrs. Graves had developed a twinge in her shoulder, and Susan had decided, months ago, that helping Mrs. Graves was not a charity question but a community one. Theodore found them on the porch, Susan and Mrs. Graves with a basket of mending between them and Clara sitting on the steps drawing in her sketchbook. Marcus was visible in the distance at the corral with his horses. "Susan," Theodore said, not a greeting, a statement of finding what he was looking for. "Theodore," she said. She did not stand up. She had decided, on the walk from the cottage that morning, that she was not going to perform intimidation. She was going to be exactly who she was and let him make of that what he chose. He looked at Mrs. Graves, and at the ranch house behind her, and at the distance where Marcus was visible, and his face assembled an expression that was trying to be righteous and landing closer to satisfied. "So it's true," he said. "You've moved onto his property." "I rent the foreman's cottage," she said. "Same as I rented Mr. Harcourt's property, which you purchased without notifying me, which is how I found myself in need of alternative arrangements." "I purchased that property to bring you to your senses," Theodore said. "My senses are quite intact," Susan said. "I have a home, my daughter is thriving, and I have done nothing that any honest person could object to." "You are living on the property of a single man," Theodore said. "People in this county will form an opinion." "People in this county," Mrs. Graves said, without looking up from her mending, "have known Marcus Whitfield for 30 years and know precisely what manner of man he is. Anyone who forms a contrary opinion is welcome to discuss it with me directly." Theodore looked at Mrs. Graves with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he had not planned for. He recalibrated and returned to Susan. "I am telling you that Robert's memory deserves better," he said. "A woman in your position should be in Houston, where her connections are, where the family can ensure she behaves with dignity." "Where you can ensure it," Susan said. "That's what you mean." "I mean what I say," he said. "You mean," Susan said, and she stood up now because she wanted to be standing, "that you are accustomed to directing the lives of people you consider your subordinates, and that my refusal to be directed is something you find personally offensive. That's what you mean." She looked at him clearly. "Robert could not control me either, Theodore. The difference is that Robert at least recognized, eventually, that control was the wrong ambition. I don't think you've reached that understanding yet." Theodore's face reddened. "You will regret this." "I have regretted many things," she said. "Very few of them were the things that men told me I would regret." There was a silence. Clara had stopped drawing and was watching with the focused attention she brought to important things, and Mrs. Graves was still mending, and somewhere behind Theodore, footsteps on the path announced Marcus's arrival. Marcus had seen the hired carriage. He had come to see what the situation required. He took in the scene quickly, the way a man takes an offense that's down, assessing what needs immediate action and what can wait. "Mr. Dawson," he said. He had known the name from Susan's description, and the man matched it. "Marcus Whitfield, this is my property." Theodore turned. He looked at Marcus with the evaluating gaze of a man deciding whether to try to be intimidating. Something in Marcus's calm stance apparently settled that question. "I came to speak with my sister-in-law," Theodore said. "You've spoken with her," Marcus said, "not aggressive, simply factual. I expect she has heard your concerns." "I have concerns about her living arrangements," Theodore said. "I rent the cottage to Mrs. Dawson at her request and on her terms," Marcus said. "The arrangement is legal and the property is mine to let. If you have a specific legal objection, I'd be interested to hear it. If your objection is to the character of the arrangement, I'll tell you that Mrs. Dawson has conducted herself with complete propriety. Her daughter is healthy and well cared for, and the only person whose dignity is threatened in this conversation is currently doing the threatening." Theodore stared at him for a moment. The redness in his face deepened. "I see how it is," Theodore said. "I expect you do," Marcus said. Theodore looked at Susan one more time. His expression was not precisely angry anymore. It was the expression of a man who has found that his leverage is insufficient and has not yet decided what to do about it. "This conversation is not finished," he said. "You're welcome to write," Susan said. "You seem to prefer letters anyway." Theodore got back into his hired carriage and left. Susan let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 20 minutes and sat back down in her chair with some precision. "Thank you," she said to Marcus. "You handled that yourself," he said. "I just confirmed the legal facts." "You arrived," she said. "That was what mattered." He looked at her and she looked at him, and Mrs. Graves resumed her mending with the expression of a woman keeping her own counsel, which was as close to approval as Mrs. Graves ever came. Theodore did write again, a formal letter this time, more legally precise, citing various statutes about widows' conduct and making vague references to what Robert had intended for his estate, which had not been substantial enough to be worth contesting, and which Susan had received her proper portion of already. Marcus helped her draft a response with the assistance of the county's one attorney, a man named Briggs in the town of Jessup, and the response was polite and exhaustive, and made it clear that Susan Dawson was where she intended to be. Theodore's letters stopped after that. August became September, and the heat began its slow retreat, and Clara went back to her exercises with renewed energy because she had decided. She announced one morning that she was going to walk all the way to the fence line and back without stopping. She did it on a Tuesday afternoon, 14 steps there and 14 steps back, with Marcus watching from the fence and Susan watching from the porch and the Texas sky going gold above them all. Marcus crouched down to Clara's eye level when she reached him, which he always did, because he had learned early that children did not like being talked at from above. "That was the furthest you've gone," he said. "I know," Clara said. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were bright. "I counted." "What number did you get to?" 14 there and 14 back," she said. "That's 28. "That's good counting," he said. "Will I ever run?" Clara said. She asked it plainly, the way children ask things that adults spent years building up to. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He did not give her false promises. She was old enough to know the difference. "I don't know," he said. "I think you might. Your legs are getting stronger every week, but some of what happens next nobody can say for certain." He paused. "What I can tell you for certain is that you are walking right now, and 3 months ago you weren't, and that's because you worked very hard every single day even when you didn't want to." Clara absorbed this. "It's because you helped," she said. "We helped each other," he said. "You had to actually do it." Clara considered this for a long moment. Then she said, with the directness that was her most consistent quality, "Are you going to marry my mother?" Marcus stood up slowly. Susan, who had heard this from the porch, went very still. "That's a question for your mother," Marcus said carefully. "I'm asking you," Clara said. He looked at Susan across the yard. The distance between the porch and the fence was 30 feet, and he held her gaze across it with the same steadiness he brought to everything. "I would very much like to," he said, "if she would have me." Clara turned to look at her mother. "Mama!" Susan stood on the porch with the September sun on her face and her daughter's eyes on her, and Marcus Whitfield looking at her from the fence with the patient certainty of a man who had made up his mind and was prepared to wait as long as it took. "Yes," she said. To Clara, to him, to the open Texas sky, "I would have him." Clara nodded, satisfied, in the manner of a small person who has resolved something that was taking the adults involved far too long. There was no dramatic crossing of the yard. Marcus walked from the fence to the porch with his usual deliberate pace, and he stopped at the bottom step and looked up at Susan, and she looked down at him, and he offered his hand and she took it and stepped off the porch, and they stood in the yard together with Clara between them. And it was not a movie scene. It was not a storybook picture. It was just 3 people in a Texas yard in the afternoon light, something solid and real taking shape between them. He asked her properly the following Sunday, which he felt was the correct order of things. the conversation on a Tuesday being what he privately called a beginning, and the Sunday question being what he considered an actual proposal. He came to the cottage in the evening with his hat in his hands, which Susan noticed because Marcus Whitfield had never, to her knowledge, been uncertain about what to do with his hat. "I have nothing prepared to say," he said on the cottage porch, "because everything I prepared sounded like a man presenting a legal argument instead of asking someone to spend her life with him. So I'm just going to say it plainly." "Please," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since February at least, possibly earlier, and I have spent months not saying so because I understood that you needed time to trust the thing you were seeing. I am 35 years old and I have this ranch and I am in better health than I have any right to be, and none of it has been what I wanted it to be, which is shared. I would like to share it with you and Clara for the rest of my life, if you'll allow me to try." Susan looked at him in the warm September evening. She thought about the man she had married at 22 and the fear that had grown in her like a vine over 6 years. She thought about the morning with the wagon and the board, and the basket from Mrs. Graves and the parallel rails in the yard, and 28 steps and 14 back, and a man who had spent 5 months on his knees beside her daughter without once asking what it was worth. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since March, possibly earlier, and I have spent months convincing myself it was gratitude and not love, and then convincing myself it was love but unwise, and then convincing myself that I was not worth the complication of it, and I am done convincing myself of things that are not true." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was, she thought, entirely characteristic, and he kissed her in the September evening with the care of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed and was glad to have arrived here anyway. Clara, who had been watching from the window, appeared in the doorway 2 seconds later with the expression of a child who considers events moving along at exactly the right pace. "Did you ask?" she said. "I did," Marcus said. "Did you say yes?" she said to Susan. "I did," Susan said. "Good," Clara said. "Can I have supper now?" They were married in November, in the small church in Jessup, which was not a large ceremony because neither of them wanted a large ceremony. The church held 40 people and approximately 38 of them were from the county, neighbors and ranch hands and the attorney Briggs and various townspeople who had watched Marcus Whitfield for 8 years and were, Susan gathered, collectively relieved. Mrs. Graves sat in the front row and cried without apologizing for it, which Susan found deeply touching. Clara walked down the aisle beside her mother, slowly and carefully and with absolute concentration, wearing a dress Mrs. Graves had made her from a pale blue fabric. Clara Dawson walked the length of that church aisle with her chin up and her eyes on Marcus, who was standing at the front with the county's minister, and who, when he saw Clara walking, did something that surprised everyone who knew him, which was to stop being composed about it. He recovered himself quickly, but the moment was visible. Susan reached his side and took his hand, and the minister said the words, and they repeated the words, and Marcus Whitfield put a plain gold ring on Susan Dawson's finger with the same care he brought to everything, and she put one on his in return, and outside the November sky was pale blue and enormous and very Texas. The reception was at the ranch house, where Mrs. Graves had commandeered the kitchen and several volunteers from the church, and there was more food than 40 people could reasonably consume, which was exactly as it should be. Someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a second one, and the evening went long and warm, and at some point Susan looked across the room to find Marcus dancing with Clara, slowly and carefully, his big hands on her small waist, moving her gently through a pattern of steps that she could manage, and she thought, "I am going to be all right. I am going to be very, very all right." They moved Susan's things into the main ranch house, which had more rooms than Marcus had ever used, and Clara got a room of her own with a window that faced the east meadow where the deer came in the mornings. She stood at that window the first morning and watched 2 deer cross the meadow with the focused attention of a child cataloging a territory she has decided to own. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a married winter, which was entirely different from any winter Susan had experienced before, and she spent the first weeks of it marveling at the specific texture of having someone to talk to at the end of each day. Not about anything urgent. Just about the day, the cattle prices and the mending and what Clara had said that was funny or surprising, and the back and forth of two people who were interested in the same life. Marcus was a quiet man in the house, but not an absent one. He was the kind of person who was present when he was there, who put down what he was doing when she was talking, who asked follow-up questions 3 days later about things she had mentioned in passing, proving he had listened. He was also, she discovered, remarkably funny in a dry, understated way that revealed itself slowly, like the rest of him. "You're much funnier than I realized," she told him, one evening in December when they were sitting by the fire with the cold rattling the windows. "I'm always funny," he said. "You just needed time to calibrate." She threw a pillow at him. He caught it and returned it without looking up from his book, and she thought, there it is. There is the ordinary happiness I did not believe was available to me, and it feels exactly like this. Clara continued her exercises through the winter with the benefit that the cottage's parallel rails had been moved into the barn, which was warm and she could practice regardless of weather. She was not fast. She might never be fast. But she was walking every day through the ranch house and across the yard and in the barn and sometimes, on the better days, across the meadow to the fence and back. The improvement was not dramatic anymore. It was incremental and continuous, the kind of progress that required a long view to appreciate. Dr. Hargreaves came in the spring. Not because they had gone to Galveston, but because Marcus had written to him in the fall, a careful letter describing Clara's condition and her progress, and the doctor had written back with questions, and the exchange of letters had continued through the winter. And in April Hargreaves came to Jasper County to see a patient he had been hearing about. He was a small, precise man in his 50s who examined Clara with the thorough attention of someone who had made muscle damage his professional life's work. He watched her walk. He tested her reflexes and her strength with various instruments from his bag. He asked her to do things and noted carefully what she could and could not manage. Then he sat down at the kitchen table with Marcus and Susan and he said, "She is significantly further along than I would have predicted based on the original diagnosis." "What does that mean for the future?" Marcus said. "I cannot promise she will run," the doctor said. "I can tell you that the prognosis I would give her today is substantially better than anything her original doctors in Houston could have offered, and the improvement is directly attributable to the exercises and to the consistency with which they were practiced." He looked at Marcus. "You read the pamphlet carefully." "I read it several times," Marcus said. "You made her do it even when she didn't want to." "She made herself do it," Marcus said. "I just showed up." The doctor smiled briefly. "In my experience, showing up is 90% of the work." He turned to Susan. "Continue the exercises. Bring her to Galveston in the autumn and I will assess her again. There is a new technique I have been developing that may benefit the specific muscle groups she's working to rebuild." After the doctor left, Marcus and Susan sat on the porch in the April warmth and did not say anything for a while. "Thank you," Susan said, "for writing to him, for all of it." "I just wrote a letter," he said. "You have been writing letters and building rails and showing up for 18 months, she said. "Don't minimize it to me." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "You're welcome." She took his hand and held it in both of hers. The cattle were moving in the south pasture, and the air smelled like spring grass and new earth, and the large, uncomplicated future. Summer brought work, as it always did. The ranch ran on a rhythm that Susan had begun to understand over the months, the early mornings and the late evenings, and the way the whole operation breathed in and out with the seasons. She found her place in it gradually, not by replacing anything that had been there before, but by adding to it in ways that felt natural. She managed the household accounts with an efficiency that surprised Marcus, who was excellent at ranching, and less naturally gifted at columns of numbers. She brought the same attention to Mrs. Graves's kitchen that she brought to everything, and the two of them developed a working relationship that was warm and unsentimental and exactly right. She also, in the summer of 1880, discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Marcus on a Tuesday evening, which meant Tuesdays had a pattern in their life now. He was at the table with the account books when she came in from the bedroom where she had been sitting with the knowledge for 2 days, deciding how to say it. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. He looked up from the account books. The lamp on the table made warm shadows across his face. "When?" he said. "January, if I'm counting correctly." He stood up. He crossed the kitchen and he took both her hands and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something that was joy and something that was also something deeper than joy. Something she thought might be the feeling of a man who had been alone for a very long time, recognizing that he was not any more. "Are you well?" he said first. That was the first thing. "I am very well," she said. Then he smiled, and it was the largest smile she had seen from him, which was not a large smile by most standards, but from Marcus Whitfield it was the equivalent of someone else shouting it from a rooftop. He held her carefully for a long time in the kitchen light. Clara took the news with characteristic gravity. She sat with it for a full day before she came back to Susan with questions, and the questions were thorough and practical, addressing the sleeping arrangements and the noise level and whether the baby would be allowed to touch her things. Susan answered all of them seriously. "Will I still do my exercises?" Clara said. "Every day," Susan said. "Nothing about that changes." "Good," Clara said. "I want to be walking better by the time it comes. I want it to see me walking." Susan held her daughter's face in her hands, this serious, strong, impossible child. "You are already walking," she said. "You have been walking for months." "Better," Clara said. "I want to walk better." She did. By January, when Marcus Whitfield the younger arrived in the world on a cold morning with the fire going in the bedroom fireplace and Mrs. Graves in attendance because the county doctor was delayed by a flooded road, Clara Dawson walked from her bedroom to the door of Susan's room and stood in the doorway and looked at the small, red-faced, furious person in her mother's arms. "He's loud," Clara said. "He is," Susan agreed. "Is he all right?" "He is very all right," Susan said. "He's perfect." Clara walked into the room carefully and stood beside the bed and looked down at the baby with the expression she brought to things she was deciding about. Then she reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby, as newborns do, closed its tiny fist around her finger. Clara's expression changed into something that had no name. "Hello," she said very quietly. "I'm your sister." Marcus was in the room. He had been there since the beginning because Susan had asked him to be. He stood with his back to the wall watching his wife and his stepdaughter and his new son, and his face was the face of a man who understood, completely and without complication, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He came to the bed and sat beside Susan, and she leaned into him, and they both looked at the baby, and the baby looked at nothing in particular, the way newborns do. "Hello," Marcus said to his son. Not loudly, just quietly, the way he said everything. "He'll need a name," Susan said. "I was thinking Thomas," Marcus said, "if that suits you." "Thomas Whitfield," Susan said, and felt how it landed, how right it was. "That suits me very much." They named him Thomas Marcus Whitfield, which was not a small name for a small person, but he grew into it. Mrs. Graves, when told the name, approved of it with the decisiveness she brought to all her verdicts, and then went back to the kitchen to make a meal large enough for a celebration, which it was. The autumn visit to Galveston happened in October, when Thomas was 9 months old and Clara was 8 and had been walking without any assistance at all for 4 months. Dr. Hargreaves examined her in his Galveston office with the same thorough precision of his ranch visit, and when he was done, he sat back and looked at her over his glasses. "Walk across the room for me," he said. Clara walked across the room. She turned. She walked back. "Again," he said. "A little faster." She walked faster. Susan gripped Marcus's hand. "Stop," Hargreaves said. He was quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" "Normal," Clara said, then she thought about it. "Mostly normal. Some days my left leg is more tired, but mostly it feels like walking." "It looks like walking," Hargreaves said. He looked at Marcus and Susan. "I cannot explain to you the degree to which what I'm seeing is outside of what I would have expected. The damage from her initial fever was significant. What you would typically see at this stage, with this level of original impact, is partial recovery, not this." He gestured at Clara, who had sat back down and was reading a pamphlet she had found on his bookshelf. "She will need to continue the exercises for at least another year. The left leg will always require attention, but I am looking at a child who is going to live a full and physically capable life." Susan made a sound that was not a word. Hargreaves looked at her with professional kindness. "I will tell you frankly," he said, "that I have never attributed a medical outcome entirely to exercise and consistency, because there are always variables. But I will also tell you that consistency of effort over a sustained period in a child who is otherwise healthy and determined produces outcomes that feel like miracles and are actually just the body being given what it needs." He looked at Marcus. "Someone gave this child what she needed and did not stop giving it." Marcus said nothing. He was looking at Clara, who had turned a page in the pamphlet and was deeply engrossed in something about the skeleton. On the journey back from Galveston, on the long wagon road north through the coastal plain, Clara sat between Marcus and Susan on the wagon seat because she had decided that was the correct arrangement, and Thomas was in the back in his basket, asleep with the absolute confidence of a 9-month-old who has no doubts about the world. "Dr. Hargreaves said I'll be fine," Clara said at one point to the road ahead of her. "He did," Marcus said. "I knew I would be," she said. This was somewhat revisionist history, but Susan let it stand because it was the kind of history a person needed. "I know you did," Marcus said. "Because you helped," Clara said. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment, just as a fact being stated. "You helped yourself," he said. "We helped each other," Clara said, using his exact words from the September afternoon 14 months ago, back when she was 6 and he was building her rails in the yard. She had remembered them all this time. "That's what you said." "That's what I said," he confirmed. Clara nodded. "That's true," she said, and then she went back to watching the road. Susan leaned slightly into Marcus on the wagon seat, and he put an arm around her, and the Texas landscape rolled past them in the October light, flat and enormous, and full of the particular grace of ordinary days. By the spring of 1881, the ranch had grown. Marcus had bought the property to the south, an additional 200 acres that he had been watching for 5 years, and the cattle operation expanded accordingly. He hired 2 more men, bringing the crew to 7, and Susan managed the payroll accounts with the same careful precision she had brought to the household budget. It was not a small operation anymore. It was a substantial one, and running it required more hands in more departments than either of them had initially imagined. Susan found that she was good at the business end of the ranch. She had a mind for numbers and for negotiation, and she had learned, in the years since leaving Houston, that she was more capable than she had been allowed to become in her previous life. She began accompanying Marcus to the county meetings where cattle prices were discussed and land decisions made, and the other ranchers' initial surprise at her presence gave way, over time, to the practical recognition that she knew what she was talking about. Theodore Dawson wrote one more letter, in the spring of 1881, announcing that he had married again and had moved to Denver, and wished to convey that he had no further business with Susan Dawson, or Mrs. Whitfield as she apparently was now. The letter managed to be insulting in its phrasing while also being a genuine withdrawal, which was such a characteristic Theodore achievement that Susan almost felt affectionate about it. She showed it to Marcus, who read it and said, "He's done then." "He's done," she said. "Good," he said, and they moved on. Clara's 9th birthday arrived in June of 1881, and she celebrated it by running. Not a sprint, not an athletic display, but a genuine run, 50 feet across the yard in the morning light, while Marcus and Susan watched from the porch. The fast, ungainly run of a child who is discovering something the rest of the world takes for granted, and is doing it anyway with her whole heart. She stumbled once and caught herself and kept going and reached the fence and turned around and shouted something back at them that the distance made unintelligible, but the tone of was perfectly clear. Marcus was on his feet before Susan realized he had stood up. He was laughing. It was a full, clean, uncomplicated laugh, the kind Susan had not heard from him until Clara came into his life, and she stood on the porch and watched him laugh in the morning light and felt the whole history of the past 2 years catch up with her at once. The wagon wheel and the board, the pamphlet and the rails, the afternoons at 3 o'clock, the fence-line conversations in the purple evenings, the letter from Theodore and the man who had confirmed legal facts and done it quietly, the proposal with the hat in his hands, the November wedding with 38 people and a blue dress, and a small girl walking down the aisle. She felt all of it, and she went down the porch steps and across the yard to where he was standing, and she put both arms around him and held on. He held her back, his big steady arms around her, both of them watching Clara come running back across the yard. "She ran," he said. "She ran," Susan said. Thomas pulled himself up to standing at the fence rail behind them at exactly that moment, which was the first time he had managed it, and stood there on his 10-month legs looking at his sister with the concentrated attention of someone filing away information. And both of his parents turned to see it, and then looked at each other over his head with the expression of two people who are learning together how much the world can hold. Summer passed and autumn came in, and the ranch had another good year. The cattle numbers strong and the hay stores sufficient, and the account books balanced with a satisfaction that Susan found genuinely pleasurable. Thomas learned to walk in October with the focused determination of a child who had been watching everyone else walk for months and had decided he was ready to participate. Clara, at 9, had taken it upon herself to work with her baby brother on his first steps in a way that made Marcus go very quiet when he first saw it. She held his hands and walked backward and let him follow her, and when he wobbled she steadied him without making it a thing, and when he fell she helped him up and said, "Again," in the same tone that she had heard for 2 years from the man who had done exactly that for her. "She sounds like you," Susan said to Marcus that evening. "Does she?" he said. "She said again in exactly your voice," Susan said. "She's been watching you all this time." He was quiet for a moment. "I hope she hasn't picked up my bad habits," he said. "Name one," Susan said. He thought about it. "I hold opinions too long before revising them," he said. That was the same thing he had told her standing at the fence in the evening the night he said he loved her. "That one's probably not the one she's copying," Susan said. They sat on the porch in the October evening, the same porch where so much had happened, and the sounds from inside the house were the sounds of Mrs. Graves at the end of her day, and Clara reading aloud to Thomas, who could not yet understand the words but liked the sound, and the ordinary music of a house that was full. The letter that arrived in November was not from Theodore. It was from a land company in Austin, making an offer on the northern parcel of the Whitfield ranch, a generous offer, more than the land was worth at current market prices. Marcus read it and set it aside and did not bring it up for 2 days, which meant he was thinking about it. When he did bring it up, it was at the kitchen table after dinner with the account books open. "The offer's generous," he said. "I saw," Susan said. She had read it when he set it down. "The northern parcel needs new fencing," he said. "That's a significant cost next spring." "I know," she said. "If we sold it," he said, "we could put the money toward the new barn structure we need and still have reserve." She looked at him across the table. "Do you want to sell it?" "I want to know what you think," he said. This was something she had needed time to accept. Marcus asked her opinion on the ranch business as a matter of course, not as a courtesy and not as performance, but because he actually wanted to know. The first several times he had done it, she had deferred, and he had waited without filling the silence until she gave him a genuine answer, and eventually she had learned to give the answer she actually had. "I think we should keep it," she said. "The price is good now, but land in this county is going to appreciate. If we fence it properly this spring and run cattle on it next summer, we break even on the fencing costs within 2 years and own more land than we started with." He considered this. "That's what I thought," he said. "I wanted to hear you say it." She raised an eyebrow. "Because I might have said something different that you hadn't thought of." "Exactly," he said. They wrote the decline letter together, and the land company wrote back once more with a slightly higher offer, and they declined that one too, and the northern parcel stayed with the Whitfield Ranch, where it would remain. Christmas of 1881 was the first Christmas Susan could remember that felt like the word it was supposed to mean. The house was full. Mrs. Graves had agreed to stay through the holidays, and several of the ranch hands who had no family in the county had been invited to the table, which meant the kitchen was producing food for 12 people, which suited Mrs. Graves entirely. Clara hung stockings and woke Thomas at an unconscionably early hour to examine their contents, and Susan stood in the kitchen doorway watching Marcus carry Thomas on his hip through the house, while Clara demonstrated every item from her stocking with the thoroughness of a child conducting a presentation. And she thought, "I walked into this county with $42 and a wagon and a daughter who couldn't walk, and this is where I am." She was 31 years old. She was healthy and warm and loved by a man who had never once asked her to be less than what she was. Her daughter was running. Her son was toddling through the house on uncertain but improving legs. There were cattle in the south pasture and hay in the barn, and the account books balanced, and a future that felt, for the first time in her adult life, like a thing she was allowed to want. Marcus found her in the kitchen doorway. He stood beside her and they both watched the scene in the sitting room, Clara now on the floor with Thomas, showing him how to make the wooden horse Marcus had carved for him move in a satisfying gallop across the floor. Thomas was delighted. The horse made a satisfying clip-clopping sound that someone who examined the toy later might discover was produced by 2 small pieces of hollowed wood on the underside, added by Marcus at 3 in the morning 2 nights before Christmas when he could not sleep. "You made the sound effect," Susan said. "It seemed important," he said. "You were up at 3 in the morning making a toy horse make a satisfying sound so that a 14-month-old would enjoy it more." "He's very particular," Marcus said about his son. "He's 14 months old. He knows what he likes," Marcus said perfectly seriously. Susan laughed. It was the full, uncomplicated kind that she had gotten back slowly over the past 2 years, the kind that had gone away when Robert started drinking, and had come back in increments since the wagon wheel and the board and the fence line and the man who showed up. She put her hand in Marcus's, and they stood in the kitchen doorway in the warm Christmas morning, and the year turned around them. Spring brought the new fencing on the north parcel, exactly as planned, and Clara's continued exercises, and Thomas's first real running, which he did with reckless enthusiasm and no concern whatsoever for consequences, which was his characteristic approach to the world. He was a bold, laughing child, nothing like his careful sister, everything like a child who had been born into a secure place and knew it in his bones. Clara turned 10 in June, and Marcus asked her what she wanted for her birthday, and she said, without hesitation, a horse of her own. He considered this seriously, and then the following week, at the Jessup livestock auction, he came home with a small bay mare, 3 years old and gentle-natured, and led her to the fence where Clara was sitting and said, "You'll need to learn to ride." Clara looked at the horse, and the horse looked at Clara with the interested curiosity of a well-bred animal. "She's mine," Clara said. "Her name's Penny," Marcus said. "She's yours." What followed were a series of riding lessons that took place in the corral over the course of the summer, Marcus teaching Clara with the same patience he had brought to everything else, starting from the ground and working up, explaining every step before they took it. Susan watched from the fence and thought about the parallel rails in the yard, and the pamphlet, and the doctor, and the long, slow work of returning to something the world had taken. And she thought about how some people were equipped by their nature to understand what other people needed and provide it without making it a performance. By August, Clara could ride Penny at a walk and a trot around the corral without assistance. By September, she was riding along the fence lines with Marcus on his horse, side by side, across the land that had become hers as surely as if she had been born here. Theodore wrote one last time in the autumn of 1882, a letter that was more conciliatory than anything before it, reporting that his new wife had given birth to a son and that he hoped Susan and her family were well. The tone was different. Marriage, Susan reflected, had a way of softening some people's harder edges, and the mention of his own child had perhaps given Theodore access to a perspective he had previously lacked. She wrote back a brief and polite response, wished him and his family well, and closed that chapter of her life with the firm, unhurried finality of someone who knows exactly what she is setting down. Susan discovered she was expecting again in the winter of 1882, and this time when she told Marcus, he put the account books aside immediately and gave her his complete attention. "January again," she said. "The timing seems to be a habit. January children are stubborn," he said. "Thomas has proven the point. Thomas came in January, and he runs headlong into everything he encounters," she said. "If this one has the same disposition, we should probably reinforce the furniture." He smiled at her, the full smile, the one that still surprised her with its warmth. "Are you well?" he said. "First thing, same as always." "Very well," she said. The baby arrived in February, actually, a daughter this time, born on a morning when the wind was still, and the light through the bedroom window was the particular clear winter gold that Susan had come to associate with good things happening. They named her Eleanor Jane Whitfield, and she arrived quietly and with a minimum of fuss, which distinguished her from her brother, who had made his opinions known from his first moment. Clara held Eleanor the same afternoon, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby in her arms with the careful deliberateness she brought to things that mattered. "Hello, Eleanor," she said. "I'm Clara. I'm your sister. Thomas is your brother, and he's very loud, but you'll get used to it." From the hallway, Thomas, now 2, could be heard investigating something with the focused energy of a child for whom the concept of quiet did not yet apply. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at his family in the winter light and felt, as he often felt now, that the years before this had been preparation rather than loss, that the 8 years after Catherine and the 3 years before Susan had been necessary distance and not wasted time, that he had arrived at exactly the right moment, and that the moment was still going, all around him, real and warm and his. The years settled into their rhythm after that, the ranch and the children, and the seasons moving through in their proper order. Clara's legs never gave her perfect ease, and she managed them with the matter-of-fact practicality she had always brought to the fact of her own body, and the horse Penny carried her on the days when walking was harder, and the exercises were part of her life now in the way breakfast was, just something you did because it was necessary, and you had learned that necessary things were worth doing. Thomas was a handful and a delight, growing with the speed of a colt and the appetite to match, and Eleanor was a watchful, curious baby who became a watchful, curious child, with her mother's precision and her father's patience. The foreman's cottage on the east side of the property, where Susan and Clara had spent their first months on the Whitfield ranch, was eventually given to a new foreman named Henderson, who arrived with a wife and 2 small children, and the wife became a friend of Susan's in the gradual, undemanding way that ranch women became friends, the way people become friends when they are neighbors to each other's lives. There was an evening in the autumn of 1884 when Marcus and Susan sat on the porch after the children were inside, and the work was done, and the year had been a good one in every way that mattered. The cattle had sold well. The northern parcel had appreciated exactly as Susan had predicted, and a neighboring rancher had offered to buy it at double the original land company's price, which they declined again. Dr. Hargreaves had written that spring with the news that he was publishing a paper in a medical journal about the treatment of childhood muscular damage from fever, and that Clara's case, anonymously described, was one of his key examples. The paper would argue for graduated exercise therapy as standard treatment. Other children in other towns would benefit from what Clara had survived. Marcus and Susan sat on the porch in the October evening, and the air smelled like the turning year, and the cattle were settled for the night, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas was doing something that required periodic adult intervention, which Marcus was choosing not to hear. "Do you remember," Susan said, "the morning with the wagon wheel?" "I remember," he said. "I was so angry," she said. "Not at you, just at the situation. I had been angry for 2 years by then at everything and nothing." "I know," he said. "You didn't try to fix it," she said. "You just brought the board." "A board was what was needed," he said. She looked at him in the evening light. 5 years of mornings, 5 years of his face at breakfast and his voice in the evening, and his hands on everything that needed fixing, and the particular quality of his presence, which was still and dependable and warm. 5 years of being known by someone who did not require her to be smaller or simpler or less than she was. "I am very glad you were at that fence line," she said. "I'm always at that fence line," he said. "I'm a rancher. That's where ranchers are." "You know what I mean," she said. "I know what you mean," he said. He took her hand. They sat in the October dark, and the stars came out over the Texas plain, more stars than any city offered, an extravagance of stars. The whole sky opened up to show what it was made of. "Marcus," she said. "Susan," he said. "That's all," she said. "I just wanted to say your name." "Say it as often as you like," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Inside the house, Thomas had apparently resolved whatever situation had required intervention, because the periodic noise had stopped and been replaced by the sound of Clara reading aloud, the clear voice of a 12-year-old reading to her small brother and sister in the way that had become their evening ritual, her voice carrying through the walls of the ranch house that was full. Marcus and Susan sat on the porch together and let the evening go long around them. There was nothing urgent. There was nothing hidden. There was nothing left unresolved between them, no secrets that could wound them, no debts that had not been settled. There was just the ranch and the children and the coming winter that they would manage together, and the particular gift of ending up, after everything, exactly where you were supposed to be. The October stars burned overhead, same as they always had, indifferent and enormous, and beneath them a man and a woman sat on a porch in Jasper County, Texas, holding hands in the dark, listening to the sound of their children's voices, having arrived at the beginning of something so ordinary and so extraordinary that they had stopped being able to tell the difference. And Clara walked down the stairs inside the house in her slow and measured way to put Thomas to bed, and she did it because she could. She could, because someone had shown up every afternoon for a year and built her rails and read her a pamphlet and sat with her on the bad days and said again, and never once asked for anything back. It was enough to change a life. It had changed 3. And outside on the porch in the dark, the man who had done it held his wife's hand and listened to his children, and was quietly, completely, wholeheartedly glad.